When people think about medieval warfare, they usually imagine swords, shining armor, and legendary knights. But the weapon that changed the battlefield the most was far less impressive at first glance. It was simple, cheap, and easy to overlook. Yet it helped decide how armies fought, how cavalry was stopped, and how ordinary soldiers could stand against elite warriors. This is how one boring weapon, the spear, changed medieval warfare. Number 1. The real weapon. If you think about medieval warfare, you probably think about swords first. That is exactly why the spear feels boring. It does not have the same legend around it. Swords carried status, showed rank, and even entered ceremony, while the spear looked plain and practical. But once you step away from the image and look at what armies actually used across medieval Europe, the picture changes fast. In Anglo-Saxon England, the spear is the most common weapon found in male burials. In the literary tradition around the Battle of Maldon in 1991, Byrhtnoth fights with spear and shield before he reaches for his sword. At Hastings in 1066, the evidence tied to the Bayeux Tapestry shows spears in the hands of poorer warriors on both sides, while Norman knights carry lances and swords as part of a larger kit. Even the sword section in English Heritage's breakdown of 1066 points out that swords varied in quality and that the finer ones were treasured by great men. So, right from the start, the sword is already part weapon, part symbol, while the spear is the thing that keeps showing up as a normal battlefield tool. That matters because it changes the whole frame. Medieval war was not mainly a stage for heroic blade fights. Most of the time it was about lines, reach, spacing, pressure, and what kind of weapon an army could put into a lot of hands at once. That is why the spear matters so much for the Middle Ages. It sits at the point where economics, class, training, and tactics all meet. It is simple enough to be widespread, flexible enough to keep changing, and effective enough to stay relevant from the early medieval shield wall to the late medieval pike block. Number 2. Why it stayed. The spear stayed important for a very simple reason. It made sense. It gave a soldier reach, and reach changes a fight before it even starts. A man with a longer weapon can threaten first, keep distance, and work as part of a formation without everyone crowding into the same space. It also scaled well. A shorter spear could work with a shield. A cavalry version became the lance. A much longer infantry version became the pike. Britannica notes that as armor and other shock weapons, especially the sword, improved, spear shafts were made longer, and the use of the spear became more specialized. In other words, the spear did not survive because Europe was slow to innovate. It survived because it adapted better than people expect. It was also practical for rulers who needed bigger armies. History notes that spears were cheap and easy to manufacture and helped equip increasingly large forces. Most of the weapon was wood, with only the head needing serious metalwork, so the logic is obvious even before you get to tactics. Compare that with mounted combat, which depended on horses and armor, or the longbow, which Britannica says required immense time and energy to master. A spear line did not turn peasants into elites overnight, but it did let rulers create useful infantry faster and more cheaply than they could create first-rate cavalry or expert archers. It also worked at several stages of battle. A spear could be braced, thrust, or in some settings, thrown. In tighter fighting, it could work with a shield wall. In open ground, it could become the front edge of a deeper formation. That flexibility is easy to miss because the weapon looks so basic. But in military history, basic often wins because it can do more jobs for more soldiers. is one of the big reasons this plain weapon stayed at the center of war for so long. Number 3. The knight was a spearman. One of the easiest mistakes in medieval history is to treat the spear as the commoner's weapon and the sword as the knight's weapon. The reality is messier and more interesting. The first medieval knights were professional cavalry warriors, and their defining battlefield tool was not the sword, it was the lance, which is just the mounted version of the same old spear idea. Britannica explains that by the 12th century, changes in saddle design, spurs, armor, and the couched lance method welded horse and rider into one unit and let the knight drive the force of the charge into the lance point. That is a huge detail, because it means the most feared warrior in medieval Europe was, in practical terms, still relying on a spear family weapon for the first impact. English heritage says most Norman knights at Hastings carried long spears called lances, and the images show them used overarm or under the arm, depending on the moment. The sword absolutely mattered. It was easier to wear, it carried prestige, and it remained useful after the first collision or in close combat. History.com even calls the lance a high-status weapon for mounted men-at-arms, while also noting that swords displayed status on and off the battlefield. But the point is this: the spear was not just what infantry used to resist elite cavalry. Elite cavalry itself was built around a spear variant. That also explains why later infantry pikes mattered so much. They were not some strange outsider weapon. They were answering the knight with the knight's own logic of reach and shock, only in collective form instead of individual form. That is why the history of the spear is not a side story in medieval warfare. It is the main line running straight through both the noble and non-noble parts of the battlefield. Number 4. The Wall of Points. Once cavalry charges became central to medieval warfare, infantry had to solve one brutal problem. How do you stop speed, armor, and horseflesh from blowing through your line? The spear was the cleanest answer. Not because one spear beats one horse in some neat duel, but because a lot of spears in depth can turn open ground into a zone that horses do not want to enter. Britannica's tactics entry makes the turning point clear. Pikes were used by the Scots against Edward I at Falkirk in 1298, and by the Flemish against French chivalry at Courtrai in 1302. Another Britannica page says the Flemish victory at the Battle of the Golden Spurs began the infantry revolution of the 14th century, and adds that the Scots at Bannockburn consciously emulated the Flemings. At Bannockburn, on June 23rd and 24th, 1314, Robert the Bruce gathered a smaller force made up mainly of infantry, primarily pikemen, and used woods, tight ground, and anti-cavalry ditches to funnel Edward II's army. Britannica also notes that the cramped terrain helped deny the English room to maneuver. That combination matters. The spear by itself was never the whole story. What changed warfare was the spear placed inside a disciplined formation and supported by terrain. The weapon made cavalry think twice. The formation made cavalry stop. And once heavily armored nobles could be checked by foot soldiers standing close and holding their nerve, a very old social order started to look less permanent on the battlefield. The horse was still dangerous, of course. A broken formation could still be ridden down. But if the infantry held, the cavalry charge lost the clean, crushing certainty that had made it so politically and psychologically powerful. Number 5. Commoners changed the math. The real shock of battles like Courtrai and Bannockburn was not that knights suddenly became useless. They did not. Knights kept fighting, adapting, and winning for a long time. The deeper change was that they no longer had the same monopoly on battlefield decision. Britannica says the Golden Spurs' victory led to political ascendancy for the Weavers' Guild in Flemish towns and ended the threat of French annexation. That alone tells you this was bigger than a tactical footnote. It was military change feeding straight into politics. The same Britannica entry says the Scots consciously copied the Flemish example, and that their success then helped push the English toward fighting on foot at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. So the spear did more than stop charges. It forced other armies to rethink how battle should be fought. You can see the same broader shift in Britannica's history of knighthood. As medieval warfare changed, armies became more and more composed of mercenary soldiers, while knights were reduced toward a minority, almost a class of officers. Later, Britannica ties the disintegration of traditional knighthood to defeats of knightly armies by foot soldiers and bowmen, along with artillery and the erosion of feudalism. The spear is not the only reason for that change, but it is one of the clearest drivers inside it. A town militia, a levy, or a confederation of hard infantry no longer had to accept that mounted nobles owned the center of war by right. The old math of power was breaking, and one plain weapon helped do it. That is a huge change for the late medieval world, because once battlefield value shifts toward organized infantry, rulers can rely more on drilled bodies of men and less on a narrow military aristocracy. That does not erase nobles, but it does start changing who can matter in war and how states think about raising armies. Number 6. The Swiss upgrade. Then the spear got longer, denser, and more aggressive. The Swiss are where this story really starts to look modern. Britannica says that after Morgarten in 1315, the Swiss learned that lightly armored infantry with the right polearm could kill armored men-at-arms, and then adapted by replacing some halberds with the pike, an 18-foot spear with a small piercing head. Another Britannica entry defines the pike more broadly as a medieval infantry weapon 10 to 20 feet long, and says its use among Swiss foot soldiers contributed to the decline of the feudal knights. That extra reach changed everything. A knight's lance was terrifying, but the pike finally matched or exceeded its distance. Now infantry did not just have to wait and absorb a charge. It could move forward in dense order and make the front of the whole unit into a weapon. Britannica says the Swiss pike square became the model for the modern infantry regiment, and that is not a casual claim. In Swiss hands, the formation was flexible enough to do more than stand still. The halfa could advance in columns, support neighboring columns, hit from the front and then the flank, and, if isolated, form a hedgehog-like square. Britannica also notes that from about 1450 to 1550, every leading prince either hired Swiss troops or raised imitators, such as the German Landsknechte. That is how a supposedly boring weapon turns into a continental system, not through a fancy design, but through reach, discipline, and repetition on a scale large enough that other states have no choice but to copy it. By this point, the pike block is no longer just a defensive answer to knights. It is a moving engine of pressure. Britannica even says the weight of those tight formations transformed the pike square into a weapon in its own right. That is a useful way to think about the late medieval battlefield. The individual spear mattered, but the real killing instrument was the mass of men using many spears as one body. Number 7. Not just one stick. At the same time, pikes and spears were never magic. Their strength depended on discipline more than glamour. Britannica is very direct here. The effectiveness of shock action with the pike depended heavily on the cohesion and solidity of the troops using it. If men panicked, opened gaps, lost direction, or got caught badly out of position, the weapon lost much of its advantage. That is why late medieval infantry systems were mixed systems. Britannica describes Swiss battle groups using the pikes for the first shock and then sending halberdiers forward to do the brutal close-range work. The same source notes that if an isolated Swiss column was caught in the open, it could form outward in a square or hedgehog, keep up supporting crossbow fire, and use pikes to hold cavalry back. Another Britannica tactics entry reminds us that other non-chivalric answers to knightly warfare included bows and crossbows, often used from difficult terrain or behind pits, stakes, or trenches. So the spear did not replace every other tool. It became the backbone that let other tools matter more. That is a key point for understanding medieval warfare clearly. Big changes usually do not happen because one invention erases everything else. They happen because one practical tool becomes the stable center of a new battlefield system. The spear did exactly that. It gave infantry a reliable way to organize space, survive impact, and create a front line that commanders could build around with missile troops, terrain, and supporting polearms. In practice, that meant the weapon was changing command decisions as much as it was changing hand-to-hand fighting. Where do you stand? How deep do you form? What ground do you choose? When do you advance? And how do you protect your missile troops? All of those questions start looking different once infantry with long spears becomes dependable. Number 8. The long afterlife. What makes the spear even more important is how long it kept shaping European war. Britannica's general entry on the spear notes that mounted knights of the European Middle Ages carried lances, and that polearms and tactics kept evolving through the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries into weapons such as the pike and halberd, with the Swiss becoming the masters of pike warfare. Britannica's Infantry Revolutions section adds that the pike remained a major factor in European warfare until the late 17th century, when the bayonet let missile troops repel cavalry without separate pikemen. That means the medieval spear did not really vanish when Europe moved beyond the Middle Ages. Its tactical job survived. The shape changed, the battlefield changed, the state changed, but the logic stayed the same. Give infantry reach and let disciplined formations stop or threaten mounted shock. In the same broad period, Britannica says traditional knighthood was being weakened by defeats at the hands of foot soldiers and bowmen, by artillery, and by the erosion of feudalism. So when people ask how one boring weapon changed medieval warfare, the clean answer is not that the spear won every battle. It is that the spear kept forcing armies to reorganize themselves around infantry depth, drill, frontage, and mutual support. It pushed war away from the older assumption that decisive violence belonged mainly to mounted elites. And by the time bayonets appeared, Europe was not inventing a totally new solution. It was attaching the old solution to a gun. In medieval Europe, the spear helped define how common infantry fought, how knights hit, how anti-cavalry systems worked, how Swiss and Flemish and Scottish victories changed military thinking, and how the center of battle slowly shifted from aristocratic shock to disciplined formations.
By the age of the bayonet, Europe was still solving one of the oldest battlefield problems with the same basic answer: a long thrusting point in the hands of disciplined infantry.